So I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the City of Toronto's annual budget, its annual budget process, some reasons why I think it's important, and how you can get involved. And Melissa's mentioned some of those opportunities already. So I would say the City of Toronto's budget is arguably the most important set of decisions that Council makes all year, that Toronto City Council makes. It's where they decide on the priorities for the city, what services, what programs, what infrastructure facilities are going to be funded, at what level, if there are going to be cuts, program cuts, budget cuts, service cuts, that's going to come through the budget, and also how they're going to decide to fund the budget, how they're going to raise revenues for those programs, services, and infrastructure. And we know it's so important to the quality of life of Toronto residents, of communities across the city. And you can think about it in all the different kinds of programs and services that you access, whether it's your experience on public transit, and I'm so glad we're going to talk about that, issues finding affordable housing or childcare, access to programs and services such as recreation, libraries, children and youth services, newcomers, senior services, as well as looking at how our city is doing in response to the climate emergency, or advancing some of the city's strategies around truth and reconciliation, around poverty reduction. It all comes back to the city budget and the decisions that are made there. Last year's budget, so the City of Toronto has a very large budget, and last year's budget, its operating budget was over $16 billion. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And its 10-year capital plan was over $49 billion. So the City of Toronto has a larger budget than many of the provincial governments and all of the territories, as the largest city in Canada. And then we're thinking about that money. Where does the money go? So the operating budget is about the day-to-day spending on services. A lot of that is staffing and different resources. And you can think of the range of services that the city provides, sometimes cost shared with provincial and federal governments, sometimes completely through city revenues. So some examples under the operating budget would be recreation programs, the parks maintenance, the work of the amazing gardeners in the city, public health services, transit operations, police, fire, paramedic services, all fall within the operating budget. The capital budget is all about infrastructure, facilities, assets of the city that support the services that are provided. And you can think of some of the examples when the city purchases vehicles for public transit, the subway trains, streetcars, buses, or they construct new transit stations or do work, major repair work in terms of roads, bridges, building new bike lanes, and the public buildings, the civic centers, the libraries, the community and recreation centers, all part of that capital budget, as well as the infrastructure and parks, such as playground equipment, splash pads, water fountains, washrooms, all part of the capital budget. And the city has three rate-supported programs. So rate-supported budgets are funded almost entirely by user fees. So the rates that we pay for those particular services, and they're Toronto Water, solid waste management services, so that's garbage collection, it's recycling and the green bin, and Toronto Parking Authority, that green P parking or parking on the side of the road, are part of the rate supported programs. thinking about the operating budget, where the money comes from to pay for those programs and services, these are the top revenue sources. So this from last year, about 30% from property taxes. Federal and provincial funding make up about 26%. The rates, the fees we pay for water, garbage, recycling, green P parking are about 13%. Transit fares make up almost 8%. And municipal land transfer tax is about 6%. So if you buy a home and you're not a first-time home buyer with an exemption, you would pay that MLTT. And those are some of the sources. So this past year, the City of Toronto City Council passed a long-term financial plan. And I just want to try to, it's a big, long document and process. I want to try to sum it up just with a few highlights, or not such highlights maybe. And it looked at what is the extent of the financial crisis, the financial problems of the city, and how they're going to try to address that problem. And there were a few key takeaways. So over a 10-year period, they calculated that they were short. They had a budget shortfall over that 10 years of about $46.5 billion, that they didn't have the revenue. And they really identified it as a crisis they've never had sufficient revenues for the programs and services that they are trying to deliver, but it's really been made worse by the pandemic and by the impact of inflation. The messages in that long-term financial plan that Toronto City Council adopted were that the city has to act now to start to try to raise revenues, to look at how can they contain costs in ways that are not damaging in terms of public services. They've started to do some of that work. The city can't do it alone. Even if they do everything in the long-term financial plan, it won't be enough. They need the federal and provincial government, and they need a new deal. And as Melissa was mentioning, there was a new deal struck yesterday. So it's kind of a beginning, I think, of a process, but important announcements yesterday between the Ontario provincial government and the City of Toronto that will certainly help the city. But I think one thing we really heard from Mayor Chow was that it's not enough. It's a good start, and there's lots to unpack in that deal, but it's not enough to deal with the budget deficit for 2024, which is $1.5 billion. They're starting out needing that additional amount of money. And it's not enough in the long run. So there's a lot more work to be done. So that's a bit of the context of this year's budget. And we just think it's so important to protect public services, to protect community services, and to really talk about where improvements need to be made and how we can get the city into a better place than it is now for folks. So Melissa was mentioning there are a couple days left of the city's pre-budget consultations. So there's a night session, a virtual session tonight from 8:30 to 10, if you're feeling up to it. There's 2 sessions at Rexdale Hub tomorrow, and on Thursday there's 2 virtual sessions. If you go to toronto.ca/budget, click on share your ideas, you'll get to the link, but maybe somebody from our team can put the full link in the chat as well. So a good opportunity to talk about priorities for the city. And then the sort of official key budget dates. So the budget is launched on January 10th, and that's really a draft budget that the staff puts together, the city staff. The budget committee does a review on January 16th and 18th. And then another opportunity to participate is on January 22nd and 23rd. And that's where the budget committee will hold public hearings, deputations, and people can sign up to speak to the budget committee, and you can share your thoughts about the budget, what's important priority for your community. On January 26th, the budget committee wraps up its work, and then we expect by February 1st, the mayor's proposed budget will be released. It'll be debated and voted on, and the final budget will be approved on February 14th. So lastly, I just want to share some resources. We'll put them in the chat as well, but Social Planning Toronto, we do a lot of work covering and monitoring, reporting, providing analysis on the budget. So we have some web pages there. You can sign up for City Budget Watch, which is a newsletter. It's also on our website that provides regular updates and information. Really encourage people to participate in budget events. If your councillor has a town hall, you can also contact your councillor with any of your ideas, concerns about the budget, and then there will be the opportunity to depute in January. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you very much and look forward to the presentations from our panel.
My name's August, and I'm here presenting with Kailin. We are from TTC Riders, so we are a grassroots organization made up of volunteers, and we advocate for better transit in the city of Toronto. And what that means is we really just fight for more affordable, frequent, and reliable transit eventually. I know I say affordable, but eventually free transit. But we'll get right into it, and Kailin will take it away first.
Thanks, August. So I'll just be starting out with giving an overview of some funding challenges for TTC. As mentioned earlier by Beth, the City of Toronto in its entirety is facing a $1.5 billion budget deficit. And in the context of transit, in the last year, the TTC made up a notable portion of this amount at around $366 million. And in 2024, it's actually projected that there will be a shortfall of $480 to $540 million. And seeing these numbers, it's pretty clear that funding is not consistent or adequate to meet TTC needs. In terms of the main source of funding, most of the TTC's funding comes from the fares themselves. Pre-pandemic, this was at around 67%, and in 2022, it was down to around 40%. We pay a lot more for buses, trains, and streetcars through our fares relative to other cities. And on the next slide, I'll kind of go into more detail. So this chart kind of shows us subsidy per transit rider across different cities in North America. And as seen in black, the TTC actually receives the least amount of subsidy at 90 cents versus some other areas in Canada, such as the York region, that receives around $4.56, as well as places in the United States, such as Houston at $4.75. And on this note, we just want to see TTC subsidies more in line with these established standards. With regards to changed service, the TTC has increased its crowding standard, which essentially means that the TTC is allowed to plan and provide transit service that is more crowded. In essence, this enables the TTC to run less service, resulting in longer wait times. We want to see this change reversed to raise the standard of service on crowded bus routes, and this revision would make the TTC a lot safer, more reliable, and more frequent. With regards to fares and affordability, the TTC provides something called the Fare Pass Travel Discount Program, which helps make the TTC more affordable for low-income Toronto residents. The TTC's operating budget in 2023 expanded this program, but only to approximately 8,000 to 12,000 people. And this does not meet the demands of residents below the poverty line in Toronto. The funding for this Fare Pass is usually through the SDFA, but not TTC fares themselves. And because of this and the changes that have been made, this means that low-income riders or low-income residents are not supported through the discount, or that aren't supported through the discount program, are essentially paying for the program through the fare increases. And on this note, we want to see the fare pass fully expanded, as well as some more meaningful steps taken towards free transit or free fare transit, as well as yes, and essentially we want more support for low-income riders as the first step. And I'll now pass it on to August to share more on funding as well as some proposals.
Yeah, thank you. So just a bit further, we'll talk a bit about safety. So, back in the John Tory era, we saw more policing, and especially on transit, we saw more policing. In September, there was a bit of a change under the new mayor. The TTC approved adding 178 new frontline staff to the TTC as part of this new kind of safety plan. And it included 130 customer service agents, and it just really added this non-police presence at TTC stations, which is what we've been calling for. However, this is just a small part, and we haven't really won the battle when it comes to making a more safer and inclusive TTC for all. We know recently that new provincial funding that came from the New Deal towards transit, it is promising more policing in the TTC. And we held a safety town hall back in February. We talked to a lot of different transit riders from different demographics in Scarborough and across the city. And they don't really want to see more policing for safety. What really wanted to be seen was more frequency on the TTC system and more frontline staff, more safety ambassadors in the system working full time, just to increase that visibility across the entire transit system. So in this coming budget season, we have a difficult task of making sure we advocate for a safe TTC that we really want to see, not one that is pro-policing. Yeah, and next, so this basically sums up the TTC's operating budget, and we kind of earlier in the presentation, we talked about the difference between the capital and operating. We don't actually know the TTC budget yet. It'll likely be debated on Thursday, December 7th, which means we'll likely see it in 2 days. So in 2 days, we'll have a lot of information. But the expected shortfall is between $480 to $540 million. And without adequate funding, we could see service cuts and we could see fare hikes happen. And as you might remember, fare hikes already happened this year. The adult and youth fares were raised by 10 cents, and we saw service cuts across the bus, streetcar, and subway system, although some of that has been reversed temporarily. Next, I'll just talk a bit about the other side of the budget for the TTC, which is the capital budget. So with the operations, it's more along, running the trains, making sure there's staff around. The capital plan goes around what new things are we building for transit and how are we taking care of transit by repairing and fixing it and making sure it's in good shape. The TTC state of good repair backlog is expected to grow to $6 billion over the next decade. And that could mean more unreliable service. It could mean more overcrowding as trains, buses, and infrastructure get older. Another thing to note is, as Adam mentioned earlier, Line 3 shut down in Scarborough back in July. And that has really impacted commuters a lot in Scarborough. They're now on RT replacement buses. Unfortunately, that means their commutes are often 10, 15, 20 minutes longer. We have been advocating for a busway to be funded in replacement of the train corridor, and it's currently unfunded because the capital plan, the backlog is simply so much and there's just not enough funding. So we are really advocating for more funding towards new capital projects like the busway, but also to address the state of good repair issue, because we don't want to ride in a slow, unreliable subway. We don't want to be in slow, unreliable buses. And that could be the reality if we don't address the capital plan. So I'm just going to quickly go over what we want to see to fix the transit funding problem and what we've heard from riders. So recently, as discussed earlier, there's been this new process, the pre-budget consultations, and it's been more of like a roundtable discussion about what people want to see. There's going to be one more happening in Rexdale, I believe on Wednesday evening. But we've organized over 70 people to come speak up at these meetings for better TTC funding. And we are going to organize even more supporters to depute to the TTC board and to the city council through the city budget hearings. So the TTC board will be meeting on December 7th, and we welcome any voices to speak in support of transit. And the city budget hearings will happen in January. We expect that December 7th meeting to be about the actual TTC budget, and that's when we'll actually find out, are we going to see a fare increase? Are we going to see service cuts? Things like that. In terms of new funding tools for the city, we are really behind the commercial parking levy. It could bring in 171 to 575 million a year that could go towards transit and other climate and equity goals. We want to tax these wealthy landlords of big box stores and shopping malls by the area of parking. Many big businesses depend on transit, but they don't pay their fair share in taxes towards it. Another thing that's being discussed at City Council is the municipal sales tax, but we want to make sure not only are we having a budget that is equitable, but that also means making sure the way we raise revenue through new tools is also equitable. And in most cases, a municipal sales tax, it's regressive. It's a tax on all goods and services. So it disproportionately impacts lower income people by raising the cost of goods and services, which is why we mostly prefer the commercial parking levy to this, because it goes after those wealthy landowners. And yeah, just a final talk on this new deal that happened earlier this week. It released 300 million in funding from the province toward transit service. But one important thing to note is that it is conditional on expanded policing in the transit system. And when we talk about equity, policing, it doesn't achieve the goals of equity in this city. We've seen from the TTC's own reports that people who are lower income, people who are Black, Indigenous, racialized communities, they tend to be disproportionately targeted by policing and fair enforcement, and they can often be the victims of police violence. So it's an approach that we need to see changed. The province will also be funding the operation of new LRT lines, and that's good. There has not been a deal reached yet from the federal government, but we expect that to happen soon. But even then, this funding deal doesn't seal the deal. The TTC still faces a really, really big operating budget shortfall, so service cuts and fare hikes could still be on the table. Most of the new funding is to the capital budget, such as for new trains, but for the day-to-day operations of the TTC, making sure the streetcars and buses and trains are all running on time and we pay an affordable fare, that's still in trouble. But yeah, I'll leave it here.